The call came in at 0600 on a Tuesday, and by 0800 the forward maintenance bay at CFB Borden was already a disaster. The CH-147F Chinook had come in the night before under emergency protocols. Hydraulic line failure mid-flight, emergency landing, the crew shaken but alive. That part went fine. The problem came the next morning when Warrant Officer 2nd Class Dennis Charbonneau and his team of 4 junior technicians discovered that the aft rotor blade assembly had sustained damage on landing that nobody had caught in the dark. The rotor head needed to be partially disassembled, inspected, and the main pitch control rod repositioned and retorqued before the aircraft could be cleared. Simple enough on paper, except the specialized torque adapter, a piece of tooling so specific it had its own dedicated case, its own checklist, its own 2-page maintenance note, had been cross-shipped to Petawawa 2 weeks earlier during a logistics reshuffle, and the one Charbonneau had been promised from the depot hadn't arrived, and the General from Ottawa was scheduled to land at Borden at 1400 hours for a base inspection that had been on the books for 4 months. The Chinook was sitting in the middle of the primary maintenance bay. It wasn't going anywhere, and neither was anyone else until this was sorted out. Charbonneau was 31 years old and had 8 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was good at his job, genuinely good, the kind of tech who could troubleshoot fuel system anomalies at 2 a.m. and not make a single notation error. But he had never dealt with this particular configuration before, and neither had the 3 junior techs standing around the tail rotor section, looking like they were waiting for someone to tell them. It was actually a training scenario, and they could all go home. "Run it again," Charbonneau said, not looking up from the technical order binder open across the workbench. Corporal Thiessen, 23 years old, good hands, better attitude than most, leaned over the assembly again with the improvised adapter they'd rigged from 2 standard torque wrenches and a socket extension. He applied pressure. The component moved maybe 2 degrees and then stopped. The geometry was wrong. You could feel it. The angle of approach was killing any chance of generating adequate torque without risking stripping the fastener head, and a stripped fastener on a Chinook rotor head wasn't a paperwork problem. It was a grounding problem, possibly a career problem. "It's not going to work," Thiessen said quietly. He wasn't being defeatist. He was being honest, which Charbonneau had learned to appreciate. "We need the right tool. We don't have the right tool. I know." They stood there for a moment, the 2 of them, listening to the bass hum around them, the distant whine of a turboprop somewhere on the flight line, the hiss of a compressor in the back corner of the bay, the occasional radio crackle from the duty desk near the entrance. In the far corner of the bay, almost invisible beneath the shadow of the workbench shelving, a man was running a dry mop across the painted concrete floor. He had been there since before Charbonneau arrived. He was always there before anyone arrived, and he was always still there after most people had left. His name was Walter Bouchard, and he was 72 years old, and as far as most of the junior technicians at CFB Borden were concerned, he was simply the man who kept the maintenance bays clean. He wore grey work trousers and a faded blue canvas jacket, even in July. He moved slowly, not because he was frail, but because he moved the way a man moves when he has learned that hurrying rarely changes anything that matters. His hands were enormous, wide across the knuckles, the fingers slightly curved even at rest, the kind of hands that had spent decades arguing with machinery. His face was weathered in the specific way of someone who had spent years outdoors in conditions that were not recreational. Nobody really knew much about Walter. He'd been working maintenance support at Borden for about 6 years, since a few months after he retired from whatever he'd done before. He didn't volunteer information. If you asked him directly, he'd give you a name, a province, and a shrug. He ate his lunch alone, usually outside on the bench near the fire door, regardless of the season. He nodded at people. He called the junior tech's son or miss with equal weight. Once, a new corporal had tried to engage him in conversation and asked what he'd done before the base, and Walter had looked at him for a moment in that quiet, appraising way he had and said, "A bit of everything," and gone back to his work. Nobody pushed further. There was something in the way he said it that made further questions feel slightly impolite. Now he pushed his mop toward the corner near the parts cabinet, and as he passed within about 4 meters of the Chinook's tail section, he slowed. He didn't stop, but he slowed. His eyes moved over the rotor assembly, the workbench, the two techs standing there with the kind of exhausted posture that tells you everything you need to know about how the morning has gone. He didn't say anything, he kept mopping. Charbonneau picked up the phone and called the depot again. The answer was the same as it had been 20 minutes ago. The adapter was in transit. Estimated arrival was tomorrow morning earliest. He set the phone down carefully and stood with his hands flat on the workbench. "Sir," said Thiessen, "what if we—" "No, I haven't said anything yet. You're going to suggest we cantilever it from the secondary drive point." A pause. "Yeah, no, not on a pitch rod. Not ever." Thiessen nodded. He knew Charbonneau was right. From the corner, without looking up from the floor he was mopping, Walter Bouchard said, "What's the thread pitch on the fastener?" Charbonneau turned. He looked at the old man for a moment. Walter was still mopping. He hadn't stopped. He asked the question the way you might ask whether someone wanted coffee, not particularly invested in the answer, just making conversation. "M14 by 1.5, Charbonneau said after a beat. He wasn't sure why he answered. Walter nodded slowly. He finished the section of floor he was working on and leaned the mop handle against the wall. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "And you're working from underneath the assembly? Low side approach?" "We don't have another approach. The cowling's limiting access from above." Walter looked at the Chinook for the first time. Really looked at it. The way a mechanic looks at something. Not the way a person looks at an interesting object. His eyes moved from the tail rotor hub to the pitch control linkage to the angle of the cowling and back. It took maybe 10 seconds. "You could work from the starboard side if you removed the lower cowl access panel. T6 fasteners. 16 of them. Gives you about 60 degrees more approach angle." There was a silence. Charbonneau stared at him. "That panel's not in the TU sequence for this procedure." Walter shrugged. "No, it wouldn't be. It's not a standard procedure. But the panel comes off clean and goes back on clean, and it gives you the geometry you need to run a standard torque set instead of a specialized adapter." He paused. "Assuming you have a standard torque set, we have a standard torque set, then you're fine." He picked his mop up again. Charbonneau looked at Thiessen. Thiessen looked at the Chinook. He was already moving toward the tail section, already looking at the cowling with different eyes. "Hold on," Charbonneau said. He wasn't annoyed. He was careful. That was different. "How do you know this configuration?" Walter was back to mopping. "Spent some time around Chinooks." "When? Long time ago." "Where?" He didn't answer immediately. He swept the mop in a long, smooth arc. Then he said, "Cyprus, Germany. A few other places." He didn't say the other places. The way he didn't say them was informative. Charbonneau stood there for another 2 seconds. Then he walked to the Chinook's tail section himself, crouched down and looked at the lower cowl access panel. T6 fasteners, 16 of them. The panel was exactly where Walter had said it would be. He straightened up. "Thiessen, get a T6 driver set." "Already getting it," Thiessen called from the tool cage. What happened the next 40 minutes was not dramatic from the outside. A panel came off. A fastener was torqued. A panel went back on. Thiessen did the work with Charbonneau's spotting, calling off torque values against the technical order, while Private Dumont held a trouble light at the correct angle. It was methodical and careful and quiet. Walter mopped the far end of the bay and didn't watch. When the final torque check came back in spec, Charbonneau made his notations and called for an independent inspection as required. He stood at the workbench filling out the maintenance record. He was conscious of a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not embarrassment, exactly. Something more like recalibration. The feeling of having your understanding of a room shift slightly without any single dramatic thing having happened. He walked over to Walter. "Thank you," he said. Walter nodded once. He was running the mop along the base of the far wall. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. How many hours do you have on Chinooks?" Walter didn't answer right away. He finished the section of baseboard, moved the bucket over. "Enough that I stopped counting." Charbonneau almost left it there. Almost. But there was something about the morning, the pressure of it, the way this man had walked past and seen the problem in 10 seconds when 4 qualified technicians hadn't found the solution in 2 hours, that made him push slightly further than he normally would. "What was your trade?" Walter Bouchard looked at him then, really looked at him. The old man had grey eyes, very clear, very steady, the kind of eyes that don't give you much because they've learned that giving much rarely helps anyone. "Aviation systems technician," he said. "Mostly rotary. How long?" 31 years. Charbonneau absorbed that. 31 years. He was 31 years old. What rank? He asked. He didn't know exactly why he asked. He asked it the way you pull at a thread because something in your chest tells you to. Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without any particular weight to it, as if he were confirming a street address, Chief Warrant Officer, and then he went back to mopping. Charbonneau stood there. Chief Warrant Officer, the highest non-commissioned rank in the Canadian Armed Forces. The rank that takes, on average, 25 to 30 years to achieve and is held at any given time by a very small number of people, the people who know more about their trade than almost anyone else in the country. The rank that means, in any room full of technicians, when you speak, people stop what they're doing. This man had been pushing a mop around the maintenance bay since before Charbonneau had arrived, and not one person had asked him a single question about what he knew. He was about to say something, he wasn't sure what, when the duty desk radio crackled and a voice came through. Borden Tower, this is Ascot 77 on final approach, ETA to ramp 13 minutes. 13 minutes. The general was early. The bay snapped back into motion. Thiessen scrambled to confirm all the maintenance documentation was complete and signed. Dumont started breaking down the tool layout and securing loose equipment. Charbonneau did a final walkthrough of the Chinook's tail section, checking every panel, every fastener, every access cover. The bay was clean. The aircraft was airworthy. The documentation was in order. 12 minutes later, a black SUV pulled up outside the maintenance bay, and Brigadier-General Larivière stepped out in service dress, crisp and unhurried, the way senior officers learn to be. He was accompanied by the base commander, Colonel Webb, and a young captain whose job seemed to be to carry things and look attentive. Larivière was not a man who made small talk during inspections. He moved through the bay with the focused attention of someone who actually understood what he was looking at, which immediately made the junior technicians more nervous, not less. He examined the Chinook's tail section, reviewed the maintenance record Charbonneau presented, asked 3 specific questions about the torque values and inspection protocol, and received 3 accurate answers. He nodded. He seemed satisfied, and then he looked past Charbonneau and went very still. In the far corner of the bay, Walter Bouchard was gathering up his mop and his bucket, preparing to move to the next section. He had his back to them. He hadn't looked over once during the entire inspection. "Colonel," said General Larivière quietly, "who is that man?" Colonel Webb glanced over. "That's Walter. He does maintenance support for the bays." There was a pause. "Walter Bouchard," said Larivière. Webb looked at him. "Ah, yes, I believe so." The general was already walking across the bay. Charbonneau watched him go, confused, and then watched what happened next, with a confusion that slowly transformed into something else entirely. General Larivière stopped a few feet from the old man. Walter turned, slowly, the way he always turned, without urgency, and when he saw who was standing there, something crossed his face that Charbonneau had never seen there before. Not surprise, exactly. Something older than surprise. The look of a man who has spent a long time being patient and has just received news that the patience was noted. "Chief Warrant Officer Bouchard," said Larivière. He said it in a tone that did not leave room for argument about the title. Walter set down the mop bucket. He straightened, not to attention, that would have been too much, but to something that carried the memory of attention in it. "General Larivière," he said, "it's been a while, 15 years. I was a major the last time I saw you." Larivière paused. "You were dragging a Chinook out of a ditch in the Kandahar Valley at 2 in the morning with a broken winch cable and a Toyota pickup truck." The junior technicians in the bay, Thiessen, Dumont, and the third one, Lapointe, who had arrived late and missed the entire morning, had completely stopped pretending to work. They were listening. They couldn't not listen. "The winch cable was fine until it wasn't," Walter said, without particular drama. "The truck did most of the work." Larivière shook his head slightly. "You pulled 3 crew off that aircraft in 15 minutes. In the dark, under fire." He paused again. "And then you fixed the aircraft." "The hydraulics were repairable," Walter said. "It would have been a waste to leave it." There was a silence in the bay that had a kind of weight to it. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind of silence that happens when a room is processing information faster than it can form words. Charbonneau thought about the morning. About 2 hours of 4 trained technicians circling a problem. About a 10-second glance from a man with a mop. About 31 years. About Cyprus and Germany and a few other places. About Kandahar at 2 in the morning. "What are you doing here, Walter?" Larivière asked. The question was quiet. It wasn't a criticism, it was genuine. Walter picked up his mop again. "Keeping the bay clean," he said. "Somebody has to." There was something in how he said it, not self-pitying, not ironic, not performing humility, that made it simply true. He kept the bay clean. That was the job he had chosen, and he was doing it, and he seemed at peace with that in a way that was not resignation, but something that looked from the outside like a kind of completion. Larivière looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I heard what you did this morning." Walter glanced at Charbonneau briefly, not accusatorially, just an acknowledgement. "A simple procedure," Walter said. "It's never simple when you don't know how to do it," said Larivière. He turned and looked at Charbonneau and the others. His voice didn't change in volume or tone, but it acquired a quality that Charbonneau would remember later as the sound of something being permanently recorded. Chief Warrant Officer Walter Bouchard served 31 years in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was decorated 3 times. He was one of the most experienced aviation systems technicians this country has ever produced. He served in Bosnia, Cyprus, Afghanistan, 2 rotations, and a number of other theatres that I am not at liberty to discuss. He has more hours on rotary wing aircraft than some of the aircraft themselves. He paused. If he tells you to remove a panel, you remove the panel. No one said anything. Thiessen, standing near the tool cage with a driver set still in his hand, was looking at Walter with an expression that cycled rapidly through several emotions before settling, somewhat helplessly, on awe. Walter had gone back to mopping. "Walter," Larivière said, "is there anything I can do for you?" Walter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a section of the concrete near Bay 4 that's starting to lift. Somebody's going to trip on it eventually. I've put in 3 requests to facilities." Larivière looked at Colonel Webb. Webb nodded. "I'll have it repaired this week." "Thank you," said Walter. And he meant it. You could hear that he meant it, but he also clearly meant it about the concrete and not about anything larger than the concrete. He was not being falsely modest. He had simply long ago decided what was worth his energy and what wasn't. The inspection concluded. General Larivière shook Charbonneau's hand, said a few words to Colonel Webb, and walked back toward the SUV. At the bay door he stopped, turned once more. "Warrant Charbonneau," he said. "Sir, next time you have a problem you can't solve." Larivière glanced toward the far corner, where the old man was working his way steadily along the wall. "Look around the room first," and then he was gone. The bay was quiet. Thiessen set down the driver set. He walked slowly across the floor until he was standing about 3 meters from Walter Bouchard. He stood there for a moment, not sure what to say. Walter kept mopping. "Mr. Bouchard," Thiessen said, "we didn't know who you were. Any of us." Walter stopped mopping. He looked at the young corporal for a moment with those clear grey eyes. He seemed to be considering something, not the words, but whether the words were necessary. "You don't need to know who I am," Walter said, not unkindly. "You need to know what you're looking at." He tapped the side of the mop handle against the floor gently. "That's 2 different things. The second one's more useful." Thiessen nodded. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then decided not to. He walked back to the workbench and started returning tools to their proper places in the cabinet. He was more careful about it than usual. Charbonneau watched him and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The afternoon shift came on. The Chinook was cleared for flight. The maintenance bay returned to its ordinary sounds. The compressor, the radio, the occasional clang of metal on metal. Walter Bouchard finished the floor of Bay 3 and moved his cart to Bay 4. He checked the section of lifting concrete near the corner, noted the specific location on a small piece of paper he kept in his jacket pocket, and made a mental note to check again on Thursday. He didn't think about the morning very much. He had found over many years that mornings like that one were not particularly unusual. Not because expertise was common, it wasn't, but because people consistently underestimated what was already in the room with them. They were trained to look outward for solutions. Call the depot, wait for the right tool, escalate to the right authority. They forgot to look sideways. They forgot to look at the person already standing there. He'd been that person for 6 years at Borden. Before that, for 31 years in the Air Force, he'd been the person people called when everything else had failed. The work was different. The principle was the same. He had a daughter in Ottawa who called him every Sunday. She thought he should retire properly, travel somewhere warm, take up fishing, stop working in cold aircraft hangars at age 72. He appreciated the concern. He also knew himself well enough to know that he would be dead in 8 months without something to do and somewhere to be each morning. The concrete was worse than he'd thought. It had lifted almost a centimetre since his last note. He wrote down the measurement and the exact tile number and folded the paper back into his pocket. If Colonel Webb got it repaired this week, that would be good. If not, he'd put in another request. And another after that, if necessary. He had found that the trick to getting anything done was simply being willing to outlast the inertia of institutional systems, which was considerable, but not infinite. He'd been outlasting things for a long time. Outside, through the open bay door, he could see the Chinook that had been at the centre of the morning's difficulty being moved back to its parking pad by the ground crew. It moved slowly under tow, enormous and somehow graceful, the way all heavy aircraft look graceful when they're on the ground, and you've spent your life watching them. He had spent 31 years keeping machines like that one in the air. He had crawled inside them in temperatures that would freeze exposed skin in 4 minutes, and in heat that shimmered off the desert sand and made the air itself look wrong. He had repaired them under circumstances that the technical orders didn't cover, because real circumstances rarely matched the technical orders, and the gap between the document and the reality was exactly where experience lived. He didn't think of it as heroism. He thought of it as a trade, properly learned. A trade learned so thoroughly that it stopped feeling like work and started feeling like a language. The particular language of steel and hydraulics and the physics of lift, which he had spoken for so long that he sometimes dreamed in it. He moved the mop in a long, slow arc. The bay was clean. The aircraft was flying. The young warrant officer and his corporals had learned something that morning that no technical order could teach them, and they would carry it with them probably for the rest of their careers. That was worth something. That was worth quite a lot, in fact, though Walter Bouchard would not have said so to anyone. He was not, by nature, a man who needed to be told that the work mattered. He already knew. He had always known. That, as much as anything, was the difference. He pushed the mop to the end of the bay and started back again.